you've reached a place where history unfolds slowly, one quiet story at a time. So settle into a comfortable position. Dim the lights if you haven't already, and let the distractions of today fade into the background. There's nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do except listen. Together, we'll wander through forgotten civilizations, remarkable journeys, and the everyday lives of people who came long before us. Take a slow, comfortable breath, relax, and let the past gently carry you toward sleep. Tonight, our journey begins in the northwestern corner of what is now Turkey, in a quiet region once called the Troad, where a low, wide hill rises gently above a river plain, not far from the entrance to the Dardanelles Strait. If you were to stand there today, in the soft light of early evening, you would see grasses moving slowly in the wind, a scattering of old stone walls half sunk into the earth, and in the distance, the glint of water where the strait separates one continent from another. It is a peaceful place now. It has not always been so, and it has not always looked the way it looks today, but the quiet that surrounds it now feels, in a strange way, appropriate. This hill has a name that most people who have heard of it will never have said aloud. It is called Hisarlik, which in Turkish means something close to place of the fortress. And for a very long time, almost nobody thought that name meant very much at all. For centuries, the hill was simply part of the landscape. Local farmers grew crops on its lower slopes. Shepherds moved their flocks across its gentle rise. Travelers passing along the roads that connected the Aegean coast to the interior of Anatolia might have noticed it, might have wondered briefly about the broken stones that occasionally surfaced when the ground was turned for planting, and then moved on without a second thought. And yet, underneath that unremarkable hill, layered one on top of another, like the pages of a very old book that had been written over and over again by different hands, lay the remains of nearly 4,000 years of continuous human settlement. Beneath the topsoil and the wind-blown dust, beneath the roots of wild fig trees and the burrows of small animals, there were the collapsed walls of houses, the foundations of gates, the charred remains of roof beams, and the quiet debris of countless ordinary lives that had been lived and had ended on that same patch of ground over and over, for far longer than most cities in the world have existed at all. The story we will follow over these next few hours is not primarily a story of kings or armies, although both will appear in it from time to time, quietly and without much drama. It is, instead, a story about looking. It is about how people came to wonder whether a very old poem, one that had been recited and copied and treasured for nearly 3,000 years, might actually be describing a real place. It is about the slow, patient, and often frustrating work of digging into the earth to find out. And it is about how a hill in a quiet corner of Turkey came to be understood, layer by layer, as the site of one of the most famous cities that never quite left human memory. even during the many centuries when almost everyone assumed it had been lost forever. The poem in question is, of course, the Iliad, attributed to a poet named Homer, whose exact identity and even whose exact existence remain matters of gentle scholarly disagreement to this day. The Iliad tells of a long war fought between an alliance of Greek forces and the people of a city called Troy, or Ilion, a city ruled by a king named Priam, defended by his son Hector, and ultimately drawn into conflict, according to the old story, over the abduction of a woman named Helen. For the ancient Greeks themselves, this was not simply a myth in the sense that we might use that word today. It was closer to a shared history, a foundational story that explained where their world had come from, even if the precise details were understood to have been shaped and reshaped over generations of oral storytelling before they were finally written down. By the time we reach the period of classical Greece, several centuries before the start of the Common Era, educated Greeks already visited the region of the Troad as something like pilgrims, walking the ground where they believed the war had taken place, pointing out to one another which mound might be the tomb of this hero, or that one. Alexander the Great, when his forces passed through the region on their way toward Persia, is said to have visited a site identified in his time as Troy, and to have paid his respects there, treating the old stories as living history rather than distant fable. This matters for our purposes tonight because it tells us something important. The idea that Troy was a real, locatable place did not begin with the archaeologists we will meet later in this documentary. It is a very old idea, one that people carried with them for well over 2,000 years, even as the physical location itself slowly slipped out of certain knowledge. What happened across those centuries was not that people forgot Troy existed. Rather, they lost track of exactly where it had been. The region changed hands many times. Cities rose and were abandoned. Rivers shifted their courses. Silt filled in ancient harbors, and the landscape itself was slowly reshaped by centuries of erosion, farming, and settlement. By the time we reach the medieval period in Europe, Troy had become, for most people, a story rather than a place, something that existed in books and poems, and eventually in Renaissance paintings, a rich vein of myth that inspired later authors and artists without any particular expectation that its physical remains might still be sitting quietly beneath the ground. It was really only in the modern era, beginning in the 18th century and gathering pace through the 19th, that a small number of scholars, travelers, and eventually excavators began to ask a very simple, very patient question. If Troy was real, could its remains still be found? This question would eventually lead to one of the more remarkable episodes in the history of archaeology, an episode involving a handful of dedicated antiquarians, a wealthy and famously self-promoting German businessman, a great deal of digging in the wrong places before finally digging in something close to the right one. And eventually, careful teams of trained archaeologists who spent decades sorting out what had actually been found, layer by careful layer. Tonight, and over the segments that follow, we will move slowly through this story together, much as the archaeologists themselves moved slowly through the earth of that hill, one thin layer at a time. We will begin with the old poem itself, and with the world it describes. We will follow the early travelers who first wondered, out loud, whether Hisarlik might be the place. We will spend a good deal of time with Heinrich Schliemann, whose enthusiasm for finding Troy was matched only by his tendency to damage the very evidence he was searching for. We will meet Frank Calvert, an Englishman living in the region, whose quiet, overlooked contributions deserve far more attention than history has generally given them. We will follow Wilhelm Dürpfeld's more careful, more systematic work, and later the long American-led excavations of Carl Blegen. And finally, the extensive modern surveys that revealed Troy to be a far larger and more complex city than anyone in the 19th century had imagined. None of this needs to be rushed. Archaeology itself is not a fast process. A single excavation season might last only a few months of the year and might yield only a few centimeters of careful, deliberate digging, brushed away with hand tools rather than shovels, sifted through screens, recorded in notebooks with the kind of patience that modern life rarely asks of us anymore. It is, in its own way, a meditative practice, and it seems fitting that a story about such patient work should itself be told patiently, without hurry, without any need to reach a dramatic conclusion by a particular point in the evening. There is no urgency here. The hill has waited thousands of years to be understood. It can wait a little longer while we take our time getting to know it. Before we go further, if you find this kind of slow, factual company comforting as you drift toward sleep, you are welcome to subscribe to this channel so that future quiet histories like this one will find their way to you when you need them. There is no need to do anything else right now. Just let your body settle a little more deeply into wherever you are resting. Let your breathing slow, and let the story carry itself forward. For now, let us return to that hill above the plain. In the years before anyone thought to dig, the landscape around Hisarlik in the early modern period was one of scattered villages, olive groves, and slow-moving rivers. A place that had seen many empires pass through it, from the Persians to the Romans to the Byzantines to the Ottomans, each of whom left their own quiet traces on the land, mostly unnoticed by the farmers who worked it. The two rivers mentioned in Homer's poem, called in ancient times the Scamander and the Simwa, still flowed through the plain below, though their courses had shifted over the millennia, as rivers do, slowly rewriting the geography that any ancient army would have had to cross. Local tradition in the region had, in fact, never entirely let go of the association between this landscape and the old stories. Ottoman-era travelers and local guides sometimes pointed visitors toward various mounds and ruins, offering them as candidates for Troy, for the tomb of Achilles, or for other landmarks from the Homeric tradition, though with varying degrees of confidence, and often for a small fee. European travelers making the fashionable grand tour sometimes stopped in the region, specifically to see these sights, carrying with them well-worn copies of the Iliad and a romantic desire to stand where Hector and Achilles were said to have fought. This tourism of the imagination, so to speak, continued for a long time without any serious archaeological investigation behind it. A kind of gentle, ongoing curiosity that had not yet been matched by systematic method. That would begin to change in the early 19th century as a new kind of scholar started to take an interest in the region, one who wanted not simply to visit and imagine, but to measure, to compare ancient texts against the actual landscape, and to ask, with real seriousness, exactly where on this quiet, windswept plain the walls of Troy might once have stood. That is where we will pick up the story in our next segment, as we follow the first serious attempts to locate Troy, using something more rigorous than local legend and poetic imagination. For now, simply rest here in this landscape a while longer. Picture the low hill, the slow rivers, the wind moving through wild grasses that have grown and died, and grown again for thousands of years above the buried streets of a city that most of the world had long since stopped believing was real. Before we follow the archaeologists to the hill itself, it is worth spending a little more time with the poem that sent them there in the first place, because without the Iliad, and without the centuries of careful copying and retelling that kept it alive, nobody would have thought to dig at Hisarlik at all. So let us slow down even further and consider how a story first shaped by voice and memory, long before it was ever written down, managed to survive for well over 2,500 years. The world the Iliad describes is usually referred to by scholars as the Late Bronze Age, a period roughly corresponding to the 13th and 12th centuries before the Common Era, when a number of powerful kingdoms controlled much of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Among these were the Hittites, whose empire covered much of central Anatolia, the Egyptians under the New Kingdom pharaohs, and a collection of Greek-speaking kingdoms on the Greek mainland that modern scholars usually call Mycenaean, after one of their most famous cities. It was a world connected by trade routes across the sea, by diplomatic letters exchanged between kings, and at times by war. The poem itself was almost certainly not written down in anything close to its final form until several centuries after the events it describes. If those events happened at all in the way the poem suggests. Instead, for a very long stretch of time, it seems to have existed primarily as oral poetry, composed and recomposed by generations of singers who used memorized formulas, repeated phrases, and a flexible but disciplined structure to help them hold an enormously long story in their memory and perform it, likely across multiple evenings, for audiences who already knew the broad shape of the tale and came to hear it told well rather than to learn it for the first time. This oral tradition eventually crystallized into the written text we now call the Iliad, most likely sometime around the 8th century before the Common Era, a period when the Greek world was adopting a new alphabet borrowed and adapted from Phoenician traders, which made written composition on this scale possible for the first time. From that point forward, the poem was copied, recopied, quoted, studied, and treasured across the entire span of ancient Greek and later Roman civilization. Students learned to read using its verses. Playwrights and later poets built new works that assumed their audiences already knew its characters and its outcome. It became, in a real sense, one of the foundational texts of an entire civilization's shared identity. What the poem actually describes in its narrower plot is only a small slice of the larger legend of the Trojan War. It covers a period of a few weeks near the end of a war that, according to the wider tradition, had already lasted nearly 10 years. It focuses closely on a quarrel between the Greek hero Achilles and the Greek commander Agamemnon, and on the consequences of that quarrel for the war more broadly. Troy itself and its royal family are described with a surprising degree of sympathy for what was, after all, considered the losing side by the poem's original Greek audience. King Priam is shown as a dignified and grieving father. His son Hector is portrayed as a devoted husband, a caring father to his young son, and a man fighting to defend his home rather than for glory or plunder. This balanced, humane treatment of both sides is part of what has allowed the poem to remain so widely admired across so many centuries and so many different cultures, long after the specific religious and political context that first produced it had faded away. The wider legend surrounding the poem, much of which comes not from the Iliad itself, but from other, sometimes later, texts and traditions, describes the war's origins in a dispute among Greek gods, its extension into a 10-year siege of Troy by a coalition of Greek kings and warriors, and its eventual resolution through the famous device of a large wooden horse left outside the city walls as an apparent gift, which concealed Greek soldiers who opened the gates from within once the horse had been brought inside. This particular episode, so central to the popular modern image of the Trojan War, does not actually appear in the Iliad itself, but rather in later works, including sections of the Odyssey, and more fully in the Roman poet Virgil's Aeneid, composed centuries afterward. It is a helpful reminder that the story of Troy, as it has come down to us, is not a single fixed account, but rather a layered tradition, added to and reshaped by different authors across many generations, not unlike the physical layers of the hill itself, each one built upon the last. For the ancient Greeks, questions of whether the war had happened exactly as described, or whether Troy had truly stood where later tradition placed it, treated with a mixture of belief and reasonable skepticism, not unlike how many people today might regard other deeply significant historical traditions passed down from an era before careful record keeping. The historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, treated the war as a real historical event, the one that had likely been exaggerated and reshaped through generations of retelling. Later scholars in the Great Library at Alexandria studied the geography described in the poem with real scholarly seriousness, attempting to match its landmarks to real places, an effort not so different in spirit from the work that later archaeologists would undertake with spades and trowels instead of scrolls. As the centuries passed and the Roman Empire eventually gave way to its successor states in both the Eastern and Western Mediterranean, interest in Troy did not disappear, though its character gradually changed. Roman elites, and later many medieval European royal houses, took particular pride in claiming descent from Trojan refugees, following a tradition, again popularized by Virgil, that a Trojan prince named Aeneas had escaped the fall of the city and eventually became an ancestor of the Roman people. This same tradition was later extended, adapted, and reused by various medieval European chroniclers who invented similar legendary Trojan ancestries for the founders of Britain, France, and other kingdoms, as a way of connecting their own royal lines to the prestige of the ancient classical world. Troy, in other words, remained culturally alive and important for well over 2,000 years, even during long stretches when almost nobody imagined that its physical remains might still be sitting in the ground, waiting to be identified. It is worth pausing here, gently, to notice something rather remarkable in all of this. A city that most historians now believe was, in real terms, a modestly sized settlement by the standards of the great empires of its own time, smaller and less powerful than contemporary centers like Hattusa in the Hittite heartland or the Mycenaean citadels of the Greek mainland, nonetheless became one of the most famous cities in the entire history of human storytelling, not because of its size or its wealth, but because a poem about its final days happened to be extraordinarily well made and happened to be preserved with unusual care by a civilization that valued it deeply. This is, in its own quiet way, a story about the power of memory and craftsmanship to outlast empires, walls, and even the physical cities themselves. As we move into the modern era in our next segment, we will meet the first travelers and scholars who began asking, with genuine seriousness, whether this poem, so carefully preserved across so many centuries, might be describing a real and locatable place, rather than a purely imaginative setting invented for the purposes of storytelling. It was a question that would take the better part of a century to answer with any confidence, and it would require not just careful reading of ancient texts, but careful, patient work with soil, stone, pottery fragments, undertaken often by people whose personalities and methods were, as we will see, sometimes rather far from what we might now consider ideal scientific practice. For now, let this ancient poem simply rest in your mind the way it rested for so long in the memories of the people who first told it aloud, passed from voice to voice, evening to evening, long before it was ever written down at all. There is no need to hold onto any particular detail. Just let the shape of it settle slowly, the way old stories do, somewhere comfortable and quiet, as we prepare to follow the travelers who first went looking for the ground beneath it. As Europe moved into the 18th century, a new kind of traveler began making their way to the Troad, the region of northwestern Anatolia, where ancient tradition had long placed the city of Troy. These were not pilgrims in the religious sense, nor were they simply curious tourists following well-worn guidebook routes, though there was an element of romantic tourism in what they did. They were, instead, an early and somewhat informal generation of scholars, often gentlemen of independent means, who combined a classical education with a taste for travel and a growing 18th century fascination with using careful observation to test old written claims against the physical world. One of the earliest and most influential of these figures was a French traveler and diplomat associated with mapping expeditions in the region during the mid-18th century, who attempted to correlate the geography described in Homer's poem with the actual rivers, hills, and coastline of the Troad. This kind of work required a particular sort of patience. It meant walking the landscape slowly, comparing the flow and direction of local rivers with the descriptions given in the ancient text, noting where a described spring or hill might correspond to a real feature on the ground, and being honest about the places where the correspondence seemed uncertain, or where the landscape itself had clearly changed since ancient times, as coastlines silted up and rivers shifted their courses across so many centuries. By the closing years of the 18th century and into the early 19th, a genuine scholarly debate had developed among European classicists and travelers about exactly where, if anywhere, Troy might have stood. Two general candidates emerged as the leading possibilities, and it is worth understanding both of them, because the disagreement between their supporters occupied several decades, and quite a few learned publications argued with the same seriousness that modern academics might bring to any long-running scholarly dispute. The first candidate was a small Ottoman-era village called Bunarbashi, along with an associated hill nearby, which some travelers believed better matched certain topographical details mentioned in the poem, particularly regarding the distance between the supposed city site and the coast, and the presence of what were described as hot and cold springs, which some travelers linked to a description in the Iliad of two springs near the city walls. This site had the appeal of seeming to fit certain textual clues quite neatly, and it attracted a number of serious supporters in the early 19th century. The second candidate was the hill we have already spent some time with, Hisarlik, situated closer to the coast and to the entrance of the Dardanelles, a location that had in fact been proposed as the true site of Troy by ancient and Byzantine-era writers long before the modern debate began, and which was reintroduced to serious modern scholarly attention in the early 19th century by several careful observers, including a Scottish journalist and geographer whose detailed comparison of the site with the Homeric text, published in the 1820s, argued persuasively that Hisarlik matched the ancient descriptions considerably better than Bunarbashi did, particularly regarding its proximity to the sea and the general layout of the surrounding plain. This argument did not settle the matter immediately. Scholarly debates of this kind rarely resolve quickly, and for several more decades, both candidate sites retained their supporters, with new travelers arriving periodically to walk the ground themselves, measure distances, and add their own opinions to an already substantial body of published argument. It is worth noting, gently, that none of this early work involved any actual excavation. It was, in essence, a purely observational and textual exercise, conducted entirely above ground, using the poem as a kind of ancient map to be checked against the modern landscape, without anyone yet attempting to dig beneath the surface to see what, if anything, might still be there. That would begin to change with the arrival, in the middle of the 19th century, of a family that would come to play a quietly essential role in the story we are telling tonight. A role that has often been overshadowed in popular retellings by a much more famous name that we will meet properly in our next segment. This was the Calvert family, English merchants and diplomats who had settled in the region around the Dardanelles, and who, over the course of several generations, developed both a deep personal familiarity with the local landscape and a genuine scholarly interest in its ancient history. Among the Calvert family, one member in particular deserves careful attention here. A man named Frank Calvert, who served for many years as a British and later American consular official in the region, and who, through decades of personal observation, careful reading, and his own small-scale digging on land that his family partly owned near Hisarlik, became convinced, well before most of the wider scholarly world, that Hisarlik was indeed the true site of ancient Troy. Calvert conducted limited excavations on the eastern portion of the mound during the 1860s, uncovering fortification walls and other remains that reinforced his conviction. He wrote about his findings, corresponded with scholars, and attempted, over a period of years, to interest wealthier or better funded individuals and institutions in undertaking a fuller excavation of the site, one larger than his own modest resources could support. Frank Calvert's contribution to this story is significant not only because of what he found, but because of what came afterward and how it came to be remembered or in his case, how it came to be somewhat forgotten by the wider public, even as it remained well known and respected among specialists, when a far wealthier and far more famous figure eventually arrived in the region seeking to make his own mark on the search for Troy. It was Frank Calvert who quietly guided him toward Hisarlik, shared his own findings and convictions, and helped arrange the practical matters of land access and permissions that made large-scale excavation possible at all. Calvert received relatively little of the public credit that followed, a pattern that recurs with some regularity in the history of archaeology, where patient, careful, locally rooted scholarship is sometimes overshadowed by the more dramatic accomplishments and considerably louder self-promotion of later arrivals with greater resources and a greater appetite for public attention. We will spend a great deal of time with that far more famous figure in the segments ahead, because his story, whatever its complications, is central to how Troy came to be excavated at all, and because understanding both his real achievements and his real shortcomings gives us a more honest and, in its own way, more interesting picture of how archaeological knowledge is actually built. Archaeology, like most human endeavors, has rarely proceeded through the work of a single tidy genius moving in a straight line toward the truth. It has usually involved a mixture of careful scholars and more flamboyant personalities, of quiet local knowledge and outside ambition, of genuine discovery intertwined with real and sometimes serious mistakes. For now, let us simply rest in this earlier, gentler period of the story, a time of scholars walking slowly across a quiet Anatolian landscape with old books in hand, measuring distances between springs and hills, comparing what they saw with what had been written so many centuries before, and gradually, patiently, narrowing their attention toward a low, unassuming mound above the plain that would soon become the center of one of the most famous archaeological projects in the world. There is no need to hurry through any of this. The debate over Banarbashi and Hisarlik took decades to settle. We are allowed to take our time with it as well. If this kind of unhurried, factual company is helping you drift toward rest tonight, remember that you're welcome to subscribe so that more of these quiet histories can find you when you need them again. For now, let your attention loosen a little further. Let your breathing continue its own slow and steady rhythm, and let us prepare to meet the man who would finally put a spade into the ground at Hisarlik, for better and for worse. The man who would eventually become most closely associated in the public imagination with the discovery of Troy was named Heinrich Schliemann, born in northern Germany in the year 1822, the son of a Protestant minister. His early life was, by most accounts, difficult. His family experienced financial hardship, and as a young man, Schliemann worked in various commercial positions across Europe, gradually building, through considerable personal drive and a talent for languages, a successful career as a merchant. Over the following decades, he engaged in trade in Russia and later in other parts of the world, accumulating a substantial personal fortune through business dealings that included, among other ventures, trade during the period of the California gold rush and later commercial activity connected to the Crimean War. By the 1860s, Schliemann had become a genuinely wealthy man, and he began to turn his attention away from commerce and toward the classical education he felt he had been denied in his younger years. He taught himself, by his own account, a number of languages through intensive private study, and he developed a deep personal fascination with the world of Homer, a fascination that seems to have combined genuine intellectual enthusiasm with a strong personal desire for fame and recognition, two motivations that would remain intertwined throughout the rest of his life, and that would shape both the real accomplishments and the real problems of his later archaeological work. Schliemann traveled to the eastern Mediterranean in the early 1870s, already convinced, based on his reading, that Hisarlik was the true site of ancient Troy, a conclusion he had reached partly through his own study and partly, though he did not always give this its due public credit, through contact with Frank Calvert, the English consular official and amateur excavator, whom we met in our previous segment. Calvert shared with Schliemann his own findings from the site, his conviction about its identification with Troy, and considerable practical help in arranging permissions and understanding the local landscape. It is worth pausing here to note, gently and without excessive judgment, that this pattern of drawing on Calvert's groundwork, while receiving the greater share of public credit, would continue for much of Schliemann's subsequent career. In 1871, Schliemann began large-scale excavations at Hisarlik, and it is here that we need to slow down and describe carefully both what he found and how he found it, because the two are not easily separated, and because understanding his methods helps us understand much of what came afterward in the history of this site. Schliemann's excavation approach, judged by the standards that archaeologists would develop only a few decades later, was, in a word, aggressive. He employed large teams of local laborers, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, who dug with picks and shovels through what he treated essentially as an obstacle between himself and the layer he was most interested in reaching, which he believed, based on his reading of the Homeric text, to lie near the very bottom of the mound. To reach this level, Schliemann's workers cut a massive trench directly through the center of the hill, a trench so large and so deep that it sliced through and destroyed substantial portions of several archaeological layers above the one he was seeking, layers that later, more careful excavators would recognize as containing their own significant and distinct periods of settlement, each with its own story to tell, most of which was permanently lost through this method of digging. This is one of the more difficult aspects of Schliemann's legacy to sit with honestly. He was, in a very real sense, both the person who confirmed that Hisarlik contained the remains of an ancient city matching many aspects of the Homeric description, and the person whose excavation methods caused irreversible damage to a significant portion of the very evidence that later scholars would need in order to understand that city properly. Modern archaeologists generally regard this combination with a certain resigned sadness rather than simple admiration or simple condemnation. Schliemann was working at a time when the discipline of archaeology, as a careful, methodical science with agreed standards of excavation and recording, was still in its infancy. Stratigraphy, the careful recording of different layers of soil and their relative ages, was not yet a widely understood or consistently applied technique. Schliemann was, in this sense, both a pioneer and a cautionary example, sometimes within the very same afternoon of digging. In 1873, during the later stages of his excavations, Schliemann's team uncovered a collection of gold and other valuable objects, including jewelry, vessels, and ornamental items, which Schliemann enthusiastically identified as the personal treasure of King Priam himself, the ruler of Troy described in Homer's poem. He named this find Priam's treasure, and its discovery was reported with considerable excitement across Europe, cementing Schliemann's public reputation as the man who had found Troy, and quite literally unearthed proof of its most famous king. The full truth of this discovery, as later scholarship has established, is considerably more complicated, and it is worth walking through it calmly here. Later archaeological analysis, undertaken many decades afterward, using more careful methods of dating the different layers of the mound, determined that the layer in which this treasure was found actually belonged to a period roughly 1,000 years earlier than the era in which the Trojan War, if it occurred at all, would have taken place. In other words, whatever this treasure represented, it almost certainly had nothing to do with a king named Priam, and instead belonged to an earlier and quite different phase in the long history of settlement on that hill. This is a good example of something we will return to more than once in this documentary. The layers of Hisarlik span an enormous stretch of time, and matching any particular find to any particular moment in that long history requires careful, patient stratigraphic work, precisely the kind of work that Schliemann's early trenching methods made considerably more difficult for those who came after him. There is also a further complication to this story, one involving the treasure's fate after its discovery. Schliemann removed the objects from the site, and in a manner that violated the terms of his excavation permit with the Ottoman authorities, which required a division of fines, smuggled them out of the country. The treasure eventually made its way to Germany, where it was displayed for a time, before disappearing from public view during the chaos of the Second World War. It resurfaced decades later, in the 1990s, in Moscow, where it had apparently been taken by Soviet forces near the end of the war, as part of a broader removal of cultural property from Germany, and it remains, to this day, a subject of ongoing and unresolved international discussion regarding its rightful location. A quiet reminder that the story of an archaeological find does not always end when it is lifted from the ground. None of this is meant to diminish entirely what Schliemann did accomplish, whatever his personal flaws, and there is no shortage of documented instances of exaggeration, self-promotion, and outright fabrication in his personal accounts of his own discoveries. His excavations did establish, with reasonable confidence, that Hisarlik contained the remains of an ancient fortified settlement occupying multiple distinct periods, a settlement whose location and general character corresponded meaningfully with elements of the Homeric description. He brought significant international attention and funding to the site, which allowed further, more careful work to happen in the years that followed. He also, to his credit, gradually became somewhat more careful in his own methods over the course of his later excavation seasons, partly through his own developing experience, and partly through his growing collaboration with a younger colleague who would go on to bring far greater rigor to the study of the site. That colleague, a German architect and archaeologist named Wilhelm Dürpfeld, joined Schliemann's excavations in the 1880s and would go on, after Schliemann's death in 1890, to lead his own extended campaigns at Hisarlik. Campaigns that brought a level of careful, systematic stratigraphic recording that had been largely absent from the earlier seasons. It is through Dürpfeld's more patient and more disciplined work that the mound of Hisarlik began to be properly understood. For the first time, as a sequence of numbered layers, each representing a distinct period of settlement, destruction, and rebuilding, stretching back thousands of years. We will spend our next segment with Dürpfeld. And with this more careful, more systematic phase of the excavation's history, a welcome shift toward the kind of patient, layer-by-layer understanding that the site had needed from the very beginning. For now, let us simply rest for a moment with the image of that great trench cut through the center of the hill, an act of tremendous ambition and tremendous impatience in roughly equal measure, and let ourselves settle into the knowledge that even mistakes, made in good faith and corrected by those who came afterward, can become part of how understanding is eventually built. There is no need to judge Schliemann too harshly, nor to admire him too uncritically. He was, like most people who leave a real mark on history, a complicated figure, and complicated figures make, in their own way, for very human stories. After Heinrich Schliemann's death in 1890, the work at Hisarlik did not stop, though it changed considerably in character. Wilhelm Dürpfeld, the German architect who had joined Schliemann's team several years earlier, and who had already begun bringing a more careful eye to the excavation's methods, took over direction of the project and led further campaigns at the site through the early 1890s. It is with Dürpfeld's work that we begin to see the mound of Hisarlik understood for the first time in the way modern archaeology tends to think about long-occupied sites, not as a single city to be uncovered, but as a tall, layered record of many cities, built one upon the ruins of the last, across an enormous span of time. To understand why this matters so much, it helps to picture, calmly and slowly, what a site like Hisarlik actually looks like beneath the surface. When a settlement is destroyed, whether by fire, earthquake, warfare, or simple abandonment and decay, its ruins do not typically get cleared away entirely by the people who come afterward. It is usually far easier to level the rubble somewhat and build directly on top of it than to remove it completely. Over centuries, and in the case of Hisarlik, over millennia, this process repeats itself again and again. Each new settlement raising the ground level a little higher than the one before it. The result is a mound, sometimes called a tell in the language of Near Eastern archaeology, in which the earliest settlements lie deepest and the most recent lie closest to the surface, with each layer in between representing its own distinct period, its own style of pottery, its own pattern of walls and streets, its own small story of building, living, and eventually, in most cases, destruction or decline. Dörpfeld's great contribution was to slow down, to dig with far greater care and precision than Schliemann had generally shown, and to begin systematically distinguishing between these layers, which came to be numbered using Roman numerals, from Troy I, the earliest and deepest layer, through Troy IX, representing the latest phase of ancient settlement on the mound, dating to the Roman period. Some of these main numbered layers were themselves later subdivided into further phases as understanding deepened. But the basic numbering system that Dörpfeld helped establish remains in its essential structure, the framework that archaeologists still use today when discussing the site. Troy I and Troy II represent the earliest periods of settlement, dating back to the early Bronze Age, several thousand years before the era described in Homer's poem, if that era corresponds to any real historical period at all. It was within the layer of Troy II, as we discussed in our previous segment, that Schliemann's so-called Priam's treasure was actually found, a full millennium too early to have any connection to the Homeric king whose name it was given. The settlements of this earliest period were smaller, with somewhat simpler fortifications, though they show clear evidence of organized community life, metalworking, and long-distance trade connections across the wider region. Moving upward through the layers, later phases show a gradually more sophisticated and more fortified settlement developing on the site, reflecting the site's continued strategic importance at the entrance to the Dardanelles, controlling access between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea region, a position of real commercial and military value that likely explains why people kept choosing to rebuild on the same hill, generation after generation, rather than abandoning it after each destruction. The layer that has attracted the most sustained scholarly attention in terms of its possible connection to the Homeric story is generally identified as Troy VI, and a subsequent phase, sometimes labeled Troy VII, dating to the late Bronze Age, roughly corresponding to the centuries in which, according to traditional Greek chronology, the Trojan War would have taken place, if it happened at all, in anything resembling the form the poem describes. Troy VI shows evidence of a substantial, well-fortified settlement with impressive defensive walls, some of which still stand to a considerable height today and can be seen by visitors to the site. This layer appears to have ended through a destructive event, quite possibly an earthquake, based on certain patterns in the collapsed stonework that later geological and archaeological analysis has associated with seismic activity common to this earthquake-prone region. The subsequent layer, Troy VII, shows signs of a somewhat less grand, but still substantial settlement built on the ruins of the sixth. And this layer, too, appears to have ended in a violent destruction, one that shows evidence consistent with warfare rather than simply natural disaster, including scattered weapons, unburied remains in some areas, and signs of fire damage across parts of the settlement. It is this layer, Troy VII, that many archaeologists over the past century have considered the strongest candidate for any historical kernel that might lie behind the Homeric tradition of a destroyed city at the end of a long conflict, though it is important to say clearly and calmly that this remains an interpretation rather than a settled certainty, and that reasonable, well-informed scholars have offered different views on the matter across the decades since Dürpfeld's initial work. Above these layers, later phases of settlement continued for many further centuries through the era of Greek colonization of the site, which the Greeks called Ilion, through the Hellenistic period following the campaigns of Alexander the Great, and finally into the Roman period, during which the site, associated by that point firmly with the legendary Troy of Homer's poem, received particular imperial attention and patronage. Given the Roman tradition, which we touched on in an earlier segment, that traced Roman ancestry back to Trojan refugees fleeing the city's fall, the Roman Emperor Augustus, among others, took a personal interest in Ilion, and the site was developed with new temples and public buildings, befitting what the Romans regarded as an ancestral holy place, even though, by that point, many centuries separated the Roman visitors from whatever Bronze Age reality might once have existed beneath their feet. Dürpfeld's careful stratigraphic work, painstaking and unglamorous compared to Schliemann's earlier headline-grabbing discoveries, nonetheless represents the true beginning of Hisarlik's transformation from a treasure hunt into a genuine archaeological science. His methods, still imperfect by the standards that would develop over the following century, nonetheless established the basic sequence of the site's long history, a sequence upon which every subsequent excavation team would continue to build, correcting, refining, and adding detail, but rarely overturning the fundamental layered structure that Dörpfeld had been the first to carefully describe. It is worth resting for a moment on the quiet significance of this kind of work. There is very little that is dramatic about carefully distinguishing one layer of ancient soil from another, about recording the precise depth and position of a broken piece of pottery, about slowly, patiently building up a picture of a place across thousands of years, through nothing more exciting than careful observation and careful notes. And yet this patient, unglamorous labor is precisely what allows a site like Hisarlik to move from being a source of exciting stories into being a source of genuine, reliable knowledge about the deep human past. It is not so different, perhaps, from the way that a good night's rest is built not from any single dramatic event, but from the slow, steady accumulation of calm, quiet minutes, one after another, each one unremarkable on its own, until together they add up to something restorative. Dörpfeld's excavations at Hisarlik concluded in the 1890s, and for some years afterward, the site received less active attention from major excavation teams, though scholarly interest in the questions it raised never fully faded. It would be several decades before a new team arrived with the resources, the training, and the patience to take the next major step forward in understanding the mound. This time bringing with them the more rigorous archaeological standards that had continued to develop across the early 20th century. That is where we will turn our attention in the segment that follows, as we travel forward in time to the years surrounding the Second World War, and to the long, careful American-led excavations that would refine and, in some cases, correct the picture that Schliemann and Dörpfeld had first begun to sketch. For now, let the numbered layers of this mound settle quietly in your mind, one resting upon another, each one representing centuries of ordinary human life, built, lived in, and eventually left behind, only for new life to begin again on the same patient hillside. There is no need to remember every number or every date. Just let the general shape of it settle, the way sediment settles slowly at the bottom of still water, layer upon gentle layer. By the 1930s, several decades had passed since Wilhelm Dörpfeld's excavations had concluded at Hisarlik, and archaeology as a discipline had continued to develop considerably during that time. New standards had emerged around careful excavation technique, precise measurement, systematic recording, and the use of small finds, particularly fragments of pottery, as tools for dating and understanding different layers of occupation with far greater accuracy than earlier generations of excavators had generally achieved. It was in this changed intellectual climate that a new expedition arrived at the site, this time organized by the University of Cincinnati in the United States, under the overall direction of a classical archaeologist named Carl Blegen. Blegen's excavations at Hisarlik ran across several seasons through the 1930s, and they represent, in the view of most historians of archaeology, the point at which the site finally received the kind of patient, careful, scientifically rigorous attention it had needed from the very beginning, where Schliemann had dug with large crews and a driving hurry to reach what he believed was the correct layer, and where even Dörpfeld, for all his relative care, had still worked within the limits of late 19th century archaeological method. Blegen's team approached the mound with the tools and habits of a more mature discipline: careful stratigraphic drawing, systematic recording of every meaningful find and its exact position, and a willingness to spend considerable time and effort distinguishing between subtle differences in soil, pottery style, and building technique that earlier excavators might well have overlooked entirely. One of Blegen's most significant contributions was a substantial refinement of the layer sequence that Dörpfeld had first established. Blegen's team divided several of Dörpfeld's original numbered layers into further subphases, recognizing that what had once been treated as a single period of occupation sometimes actually represented several distinct subperiods, each with its own subtle changes in architecture, pottery style, and evidence of rebuilding after localized damage. This finer level of detail allowed for a much more precise understanding of how the settlement had changed and developed across its long history, rather than treating each major numbered layer as a single, unchanging snapshot of life at Hisarlik. It was Blegen's team, working through the details of the layer known as Troy the 7th A, who developed much of the case that this particular phase, rather than the more impressively fortified layer known as Troy the 6th, represented the most likely candidate for any historical event that might lie behind the Homeric tradition of a destroyed city. Blegen noted that Troy the 7th A showed evidence of a somewhat more crowded, more hastily organized settlement than the grander 6th layer that preceded it, with storage vessels found buried beneath house floors in a manner some interpreted as suggesting residents preparing for a siege or some other anticipated hardship, alongside clear evidence of destruction by fire and scattered signs of violence. This interpretation, while influential and widely cited in the decades since, has also been the subject of ongoing scholarly discussion and revision, as later excavators have continued to examine and, at times, reconsider the details of Blegen's conclusions, using methods and comparative evidence that were not available to him at the time. It is worth pausing here to reflect gently on how archaeological understanding actually develops over time, because this pattern of one careful team building upon, refining, and sometimes partially revising the conclusions of the team before it is really the normal and healthy way that this kind of knowledge grows. It is not a story of a single dramatic discovery that settles every question once and for all. It is, instead, a much slower and more collaborative process, spanning generations of researchers, each one adding detail, correcting earlier assumptions, and passing along a somewhat clearer picture to whoever comes next. Blejan's work did not close the book on Hisarlik. It refined the questions considerably, and it left plenty of room for future excavators to continue the process further, which is exactly what happened in the decades that followed. Alongside his stratigraphic and architectural work, Blejan's team also devoted considerable attention to the pottery found across the different layers of the site, which might sound like a modest or unglamorous focus, but which actually represents one of the most powerful tools available to archaeologists working on sites of this kind. Pottery styles changed gradually over time in ways that can often be traced and compared across different sites throughout a wider region, allowing archaeologists to establish relative dates for different layers. By comparing local pottery finds with similar, better dated material found elsewhere. Through this kind of careful comparative work, Blejan's team was able to situate the various layers of Hisarlik within the broader chronological framework of Bronze Age civilizations across the wider Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, connecting the site's own particular story to the larger, interconnected world of Mycenaean Greece, Hittite Anatolia, and beyond. Blejan's excavations were eventually interrupted, as so much scholarly work around the world was interrupted by the outbreak of the Second World War, and the site would not see another major excavation campaign for several more decades afterward. But the careful, methodical foundation that Blejan's team had laid during the 1930s would prove enormously valuable when new excavations eventually resumed, providing a detailed and reliable framework upon which later researchers, equipped with even more advanced techniques, would be able to build further. It is worth noting, too, that Blejan's broader career extended well beyond Hisarlik itself. In the years following his work at Troy, he went on to lead important excavations at Pylos, on the Greek mainland, where his team uncovered a Mycenaean palace complex containing a substantial archive of clay tablets written in an early form of Greek script, known as Linear B. This discovery, alongside related work by other scholars, eventually contributed to the historic decipherment of Linear B in the 1950s, which confirmed for the first time, with real certainty, that the Mycenaean civilization of the Greek Bronze Age spoke an early form of the Greek language, connecting the world of the Homeric poems more concretely to a real, documented historical civilization, even if the precise relationship between that civilization and the specific events described in the Iliad remained, and remains, a separate and more complicated question. As we move toward the later segments of this documentary, we will follow the story of Hisarlik into the final decades of the 20th century and into the 21st, when new excavation teams, equipped with technologies that Schliemann, Dürpfeld, and even Blegen could scarcely have imagined, returned to the site and discovered that the ancient city extended far beyond the fortified hilltop that all of these earlier excavators had focused on so intently. There was, it turned out, a great deal more to Troy than the citadel mound alone, and uncovering that larger picture would require not shovels or even careful hand tools, but sensitive instruments capable of detecting buried structures without disturbing the ground above them at all. For now, let us rest a while in this period of careful, patient refinement, a time when the loud excitement of early discovery gradually gave way to something quieter and, in its own way, more valuable. The slow, careful, collaborative work of genuinely coming to understand a place, one measured layer, one recorded pottery fragment, one careful season at a time. For most of the 20th century, the story of Hisarlik was, in a sense, the story of a single fortified hilltop, roughly the size of a modest city block, containing the layered remains of a citadel that had been built, destroyed, and rebuilt many times across thousands of years. This was, without question, an important and genuinely fascinating sight. But for a long time, it also raised a quiet, nagging question among scholars who studied it closely. If this small, walled citadel was really the Troy described in Homer's poem, a city grand enough to withstand a 10-year siege by a large coalition of attacking forces, why did the archaeological remains of the citadel itself seem, to many observers, somewhat modest in scale for such a famous and consequential place? This question would not find a satisfying answer until the final decade of the 20th century, when a new excavation project, led by a German archaeologist named Manfred Korfmann, working in close collaboration with American archaeologist C. Brian Rose, and a wide team of international specialists, began a fresh and far more extensive campaign of research at Hisarlik, beginning in the early 1990s and continuing for many years afterward. This new project brought with it a range of technologies and methods that simply had not existed during the time of Schliemann, Dürpfeld, or even Blegen. And these new tools would ultimately transform scholarly understanding of the site in a fundamental way. Among the most important of these new methods was geophysical survey technology, including techniques such as magnetometry and ground-penetrating radar, which allow archaeologists to detect buried structures, walls, ditches, and other features beneath the surface of the ground without needing to excavate them directly. By passing specialized instruments slowly and systematically across the landscape surrounding the citadel mound, Korfmann's team was able to build up a detailed picture of what lay beneath the surface of the surrounding plain, an area that earlier excavators had largely overlooked, assuming, reasonably enough given the tools available to them at the time, that the ancient city was more or less confined to the fortified hilltop itself. What this careful, non-invasive survey work revealed was genuinely significant. Beneath the plain surrounding the citadel mound, the team detected clear evidence of a much larger settlement, including the remains of a substantial ditch, likely serving as an outer defensive boundary, along with traces of streets, buildings, and other structures extending well beyond the base of the hill. This larger settlement, which came to be referred to as the lower city, appeared to have covered an area many times larger than the citadel mound alone, suggesting that the full extent of the Bronze Age settlement at Hisarlik during its most significant periods, particularly during the era of Troy VI, had actually been a substantial urban center by the standards of its time and region, rather than the comparatively modest citadel that earlier excavations alone had revealed. This discovery had a considerable effect on how scholars understood the relationship between the archaeological site and the Homeric tradition. A city of this larger scale, with a substantial lower town surrounding a strongly fortified citadel, corresponds considerably more closely with the kind of significant, formidable settlement described in the ancient poem. A place substantial enough that a long siege by a large coalition of attackers might plausibly be imagined as a serious and consequential undertaking, rather than an oddly outsized effort directed at a comparatively small hilltop fortress. It is important to say clearly and calmly that this discovery does not by itself prove that the Trojan War occurred in the specific way the Iliad describes, nor does it confirm every detail of the poem as literal historical fact. What it does show, with much greater confidence than earlier excavations alone could provide, is that Hisarlik was indeed the site of a substantial, significant Bronze Age city, one whose scale and importance had been considerably underestimated by every excavation team that came before Korfmann's. Korfmann's project also brought renewed attention to the wider landscape surrounding Hisarlik, including careful study of ancient coastlines, which, as we discussed earlier in this documentary, have shifted considerably since the Bronze Age due to gradual silting from local rivers. Geological coring studies, in which long, narrow samples of earth are extracted from beneath the modern plain and analyzed layer by layer, allowed researchers to reconstruct, with reasonable confidence, the approximate shape of the ancient coastline and harbor area near Hisarlik during the late Bronze Age, a period when the sea likely extended considerably further inland than it does today, placing the ancient settlement in a much more direct and strategically significant relationship with the coast and with the maritime trade routes passing through the nearby straits than its modern, more inland setting might otherwise suggest. This renewed, larger-scale, interdisciplinary approach to the site, combining traditional excavation with geophysical survey, geological coring, and careful comparative study of contemporary Bronze Age civilizations across the wider region, represents the culmination of well over a century of gradually developing archaeological method. Each generation of researchers building upon, correcting, and refining the work of those who came before. It is worth noting, too, that Korfmann's interpretations, like those of every archaeologist we have discussed tonight, were not universally accepted without discussion. Some scholars raised questions about aspects of his conclusions regarding the scale and character of the lower city, and vigorous, good faith academic debate over the details continued for some years. A healthy and entirely normal part of how careful scholarship proceeds, even on questions that might seem, to those outside the field, to have been settled long ago. The broader significance of this later phase of research extends beyond the specific question of Troy's connection to Homer's poem. It also transformed scholarly understanding of the wider political and economic world of the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, a world we touched on briefly in our second segment tonight, involving interconnected kingdoms across Anatolia, the Aegean, the Levant, and Egypt, linked by trade, diplomacy, and at times, conflict. Hittite textual records, found at the Hittite capital of Hadusa in central Anatolia, mention a kingdom called Wilusa, generally believed by most specialists to correspond to the Greek name Ilios or Ilion, one of the alternate names for Troy used in Homer's poem. And these texts describe diplomatic, and at times, tense relations between Wilusa and the Hittite Empire during roughly the same broad period in which Troy VI and Troy VII were occupied. This textual evidence, entirely separate from the archaeological record at Hisarlik itself, provides an independent line of evidence suggesting that a significant, named political entity did indeed exist at or near this location during the late Bronze Age. A genuinely useful piece of the puzzle, even though, again, it does not by itself confirm the specific narrative details of the Homeric tradition. Today, Hisarlik is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, protected and studied under continued, carefully regulated archaeological oversight, with excavation and research work continuing at a considerably slower and more deliberate pace than in the days of Schliemann's Great Trench, under the direction of subsequent generations of Turkish and international archaeologists who have carried this long project forward into the 21st century. Visitors to the site today can walk among the exposed walls of several different layers at once, standing, in a very literal sense, in a place where thousands of years of human history have been folded together into a single, quiet hillside, a place that took more than a century of careful, patient, occasionally flawed, but ultimately dedicated scholarly work to properly understand. In our final segments tonight, we will slow down even further and consider what this long story, taken as a whole, tells us not just about one particular ancient city, but about the nature of historical memory itself, about how a poem sung aloud by unnamed voices nearly 3,000 years ago eventually led careful researchers, working patiently across many generations, back to a real and specific place in the ground. We will also spend some time simply walking in our imagination through the layered ruins as they exist today. A quiet closing tour of the hill that has occupied our attention for so many hours tonight. For now, let this larger, more complete picture of the ancient city settle gently in your mind. The fortified citadel and its wider lower town spreading out around the base of the hill. The shifted coastline that once brought the sea much closer than it reaches today. And the quiet, patient decades of careful survey work that finally revealed a city considerably larger and considerably more significant than anyone had fully appreciated for over 100 years of digging. Having followed this long excavation story from the earliest travelers through more than a century of careful digging, it feels appropriate now to slow down even further and consider, calmly, and without any need to reach a firm final verdict, what all of this careful work actually tells us about the relationship between Homer's poem and the real place we have spent this evening exploring together. It is worth beginning by acknowledging something that serious scholars of this subject generally agree upon, even when they disagree about many of the specific details. The Iliad is a work of poetry, composed and shaped over generations through oral tradition before being fixed in written form. And it was never intended by the people who created and preserved it to function as a precise historical record in the way that a modern historian might understand that term. It contains divine intervention, exaggerated feats of individual combat, and narrative structures clearly shaped by the demands of oral storytelling and poetic tradition, rather than by any impulse toward strict factual documentation. Expecting it to match the archaeological record in every specific detail would be, in a sense, applying the wrong kind of standard to a work that was never trying to meet that standard in the first place. And yet, as we have seen across this documentary, the poem also contains a surprising number of details that align, in broad and sometimes even fairly specific ways, with what careful archaeological and geological research has revealed about the real landscape and the real historical context of the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. The general location of Troy, near the entrance to the straits connecting the Aegean and Black Seas, matches the position of Hisarlik. The description of a substantial, well-fortified city, once dismissed by some earlier scholars as poetic exaggeration, given the citadel's relatively modest size, aligns considerably better with the larger lower city revealed by Korfmann's later survey work. The broader political world implied by the poem, of interconnected kingdoms engaged in trade, diplomacy, and periodic conflict across the Eastern Mediterranean, corresponds in a general way with what Hittite, Egyptian, and Mycenaean textual records tell us about the real political landscape of the 13th century before the Common Era. and the possible identification of the Hittite recorded kingdom of Walusa with the Troy or Ilios of later Greek tradition offers a genuinely intriguing, if not entirely certain, piece of independent textual evidence for the existence of a significant named political entity at or near this location during roughly the right period. At the same time, it would be inaccurate and would misrepresent the careful, honest work of the archaeologists we have followed tonight. To suggest that any of this amounts to proof that the Trojan War happened in the specific way the poem describes, with a 10-year siege, a wooden horse, and a cast of named individual heroes whose personal actions shaped the outcome of the conflict in the dramatic ways the poem portrays. What the archaeological and textual evidence more modestly supports is something like this: a real, significant, strategically located city existed at Hisarlik during the late Bronze Age. That city experienced at least one, and quite possibly several destructive events during the relevant period, including what appears to have been a violent destruction at the end of the phase known as Troy the Seventh A. The broader political world in which this city existed did involve real tensions, and at times, real conflicts between neighboring powers. And a poetic tradition eventually developed, whether from a genuine folk memory of some specific event, from a general awareness of conflicts common to this era and region, or from some combination of both, which crystallized many generations later into the poem we now call the Iliad. This more careful, more modest way of describing the relationship between poem and place is not, in any sense, a disappointing conclusion. If anything, it reflects the genuinely fascinating and genuinely human way that historical memory actually seems to work, gathering fragments of real experience, real places, and real conflicts, and gradually reshaping them across generations of retelling into stories that serve purposes beyond simple factual record-keeping, purposes of meaning-making, of cultural identity, of moral reflection on courage, loss, pride, and grief, themes that remain just as resonant for audiences today as they apparently were for audiences nearly 3,000 years ago. There's also something worth noticing, calmly and without excessive philosophizing, in the fact that this entire long project of excavation, spanning Schliemann's ambitious and flawed early trenching, Dürpfeld's more careful stratigraphic work, Blegen's rigorous scientific refinement, and Korfmann's technologically advanced survey research, was set in motion in the first place by nothing more than the enduring power of a very old story, carefully preserved and passed down by countless generations of readers, reciters, and copyists who valued it enough to keep it alive. Without that long chain of careful preservation, stretching back to unnamed oral poets performing in a world without writing, nobody would have had any particular reason to dig, patiently and repeatedly, into an unremarkable hill above a quiet Anatolian plain. The story itself, quite apart from whatever specific historical events may or may not lie behind it, proved powerful enough to eventually lead careful researchers back to a real and specific place in the world, a place that had been waiting quietly beneath the ground for a very long time. It is worth also noting, gently, that Hisarlik is far from unique in this regard, even if it remains one of the most famous examples. Archaeology has, on a number of other occasions across the world, found real physical evidence connected, with varying degrees of confidence, to places and events described in older oral or written traditions from other regions and civilizations entirely separate from the Greek world we have focused on tonight. Each case tends to require the same kind of patient, careful, and appropriately humble, scholarly approach that we have followed across the story of Hisarlik this evening, neither uncritically accepting every detail of an old tradition as literal historical fact, nor dismissing such traditions entirely as pure invention with nothing real behind them, but instead patiently, carefully, and honestly following the physical evidence wherever it happens to lead, layer by careful layer, season by careful season, sometimes across more than a century of dedicated work by many different hands. As we move toward the closing segments of tonight's documentary, we will take a slower, more contemplative walk through the site as it exists today, considering what a modern visitor actually encounters when they stand upon that quiet hill. And we will close, gently, with some reflection on why this particular story of a poem, a hill, and more than 100 years of careful digging continues to hold such a durable place in human curiosity. Even now, so long after the events it may or may not describe. For now, let this more careful, more measured understanding settle quietly in your mind. Not a simple confirmation that an old story was entirely true, nor a simple dismissal that it was entirely invented, but something gentler, and in its own way, more satisfying. A recognition that old stories and real places can be connected to one another in complicated, partial, genuinely interesting ways that patient scholarship can help us understand a little better, one careful season of work at a time. Let us slow down even further now and imagine together what it might feel like to actually walk across the site of Hisarlik as it exists today, more than a century and a half after Schliemann first put a large team of workers to digging into its slopes. A visitor arriving today would likely first encounter a modern reconstruction near the entrance to the site. A large wooden horse, built in relatively recent times for the benefit of tourists, standing as a somewhat playful, modern acknowledgement of the story that first drew the world's attention to this quiet hill. Even though, as we discussed earlier, this particular detail of the wooden horse comes to us primarily from later texts rather than from the Iliad itself. From there, a gravel path leads up onto the mound proper, winding among the exposed remains of many different periods of settlement, layered close together in a way that can feel, to a careful and unhurried visitor, quite unlike walking through any single ancient city. It is, instead, more like walking through several different cities all at once, their walls and foundations overlapping and interweaving across the surface of the hill in ways that require a practiced eye or a good guidebook to fully untangle. Along the eastern side of the mound, visitors can see the massive trench that Schliemann's workers cut through the hill in the 1870s, a deep scar in the landscape that, whatever damage it caused to the archaeological record, now serves as its own kind of historical monument, a physical record of the earliest, most ambitious, and most impatient phase of the site's modern excavation history. Nearby, visitors can walk alongside sections of the impressive defensive walls belonging to the layer known as Troy VI, walls constructed from large, carefully fitted limestone blocks, sloping inward as they rise in a style of fortification architecture that would have made the settlement genuinely difficult to assault directly. A real testament to the engineering capability of the people who built it more than 3,000 years ago. Elsewhere on the mound, visitors can see the remains of a large ramp, believed to have provided ceremonial or practical access up to the citadel gate during one of the site's Bronze Age phases, as well as the foundations of temples and public buildings dating to the later Greek and Roman periods of occupation, when the site, by then known as Ilion, had become an important place of pilgrimage and imperial patronage, precisely because of its association with the ancient Homeric tradition. Standing in one particular spot on the mound, a careful visitor might, in principle, be looking simultaneously at a wall built during the early Bronze Age, a foundation from the era potentially connected to the Homeric story, and a paved Roman road built many centuries later still, all within the space of a few unhurried steps, a genuinely striking illustration of just how many layers of human history have accumulated on this single quiet hillside. Beyond the mound itself, in the surrounding plain, the traces of the larger lower city that Korfmann's team identified through geophysical survey are, for the most part, not visible to the naked eye at all, buried as they remain beneath centuries of agricultural soil, invisible to a casual visitor, but very much present nonetheless, quietly extending the true scale of the ancient settlement far beyond what any visitor standing on the mound alone might initially assume. This is, in its own way, a fitting reminder of how much of this story has depended not on what is immediately visible, but on patient, careful, often invisible work, whether that work involves geophysical instruments passed slowly across an empty field, or centuries of careful copying and preservation of an old poem passed from one generation of readers to the next. Looking out from the higher points of the mound, a visitor today can still see, in the distance, the waters of the Dardanelles, glinting in the light much as they likely did for the countless generations of people who lived, worked, and eventually died on this hillside across more than 4,000 years of continuous, or near continuous settlement. The specific shoreline has moved considerably closer to the horizon than it stood during the Bronze Age, as the slow accumulation of river silt gradually pushed the coast further from the ancient city walls across the intervening millennia. But the general relationship between hill, plain, and sea remains recognizable. A quiet continuity linking the ancient landscape to the modern one, even as so much else has changed almost beyond recognition. The site today falls under the protection and ongoing study of Turkish archaeological authorities, working in continued collaboration with international research teams, ensuring that any further excavation proceeds according to the careful, methodical standards that took the discipline of archaeology so many decades and so many difficult lessons to fully develop. Much of the mound remains unexcavated even now, deliberately left undisturbed for future generations of researchers who will, in all likelihood, have access to tools and methods considerably more advanced than anything available today. A patient and, in its own way, quite humble acknowledgement that this long project of understanding remains genuinely unfinished, and perhaps always will be. There's something worth sitting with quietly in that last thought. After more than 150 years of careful, sometimes flawed, gradually improving archaeological work, the story of Hisarlik has still not reached any final, complete conclusion. New questions continue to arise, even as old ones are gradually answered. This is not a weakness in the story we have spent this evening following together. It is, instead, simply the honest nature of careful historical and archaeological inquiry, which rarely, if ever, reaches a tidy, permanent stopping point, and instead continues patiently across generations. Each new group of researchers adding what they can to an understanding that remains, by its very nature, always somewhat provisional, always open to gentle revision as new evidence and new methods become available. As we move toward the final segment of tonight's documentary, let us take a few more quiet minutes simply resting in this image of the hill as it stands today. Quiet, partially excavated, still holding a great deal of its long history safely within the earth, waiting with the same patience it has shown for thousands of years already, for whatever careful attention future generations might eventually choose to bring to it. For now, let your own body rest here as well, heavy and comfortable, wherever you happen to be lying, while this old, layered hillside continues its own slow, patient existence, largely unbothered by the passage of time, holding its long and complicated history quietly within itself, the way a settled mind might hold a long and complicated day quietly within itself, before finally letting go gently into sleep. As we come to the close of tonight's journey, let us rest for a little while longer on the broader meaning of the story we have followed together. From a poem first sung aloud by unnamed voices in a world without writing, through centuries of careful copying and preservation, through the first hesitant travelers who wondered whether the story might describe a real place, through the ambitious and imperfect digging of Heinrich Schliemann, through the quieter, more careful contributions of Frank Calvert and Wilhelm Dürpfeld, through the rigorous scientific work of Carl Blegen, and finally to the technologically advanced surveys of Manfred Korfmann and his colleagues, which revealed a city considerably larger and more significant than more than a century of earlier digging alone had managed to show. It is worth noticing gently how many different kinds of human effort were required to bring us to our current, still incomplete, understanding of this single quiet hillside. It required poets and singers, working long before writing existed, who found a way to shape memory and meaning into a form durable enough to survive, unwritten, across many generations. It required scribes and scholars across many centuries of the ancient and medieval world, who copied and preserved and studied the resulting poem long after the world that produced it had disappeared. It required patient local observers like Frank Calvert, whose decades of careful attention to a landscape he knew intimately provided an essential foundation that a more famous outsider would later build upon, not always with full acknowledgement. It required a complicated, ambitious, deeply flawed, but genuinely consequential figure like Schliemann, whose personal drive, however messily applied, brought the resources and attention needed to begin serious excavation at all. And it required successive generations of increasingly careful, increasingly rigorous archaeologists, each one correcting and refining the work of those who came before, slowly transforming an exciting but scientifically shaky treasure hunt into a genuinely reliable body of historical knowledge. This layered, collaborative, imperfect process of discovery mirrors, in its own way, the layered physical structure of the site itself, each contribution building upon, and sometimes partially obscuring or damaging, the contributions that came before, with later, more careful work needed to sort out what had actually been found and what it actually meant. There is something quietly comforting, perhaps, in recognizing that even flawed, imperfect efforts, made in good faith and later corrected through patient further work, can still contribute meaningfully to genuine understanding over time. Very little in this story proceeded neatly or perfectly, and yet, across more than a century of collective effort, a real and substantial body of reliable knowledge did gradually emerge from that imperfect process, layer by careful layer, much like the mound itself. There is also something worth sitting with regarding what this long project tells us about the relationship between story and place more broadly. For nearly 3,000 years, people carried a poem about a fallen city with them, long after any specific memory of the actual place had faded from common knowledge. The story survived and mattered and shaped entire civilizations' sense of their own origins and values, quite independently of whether anyone could point to the actual physical location where it may have happened. And yet, when careful people finally did go looking, patiently and persistently, across more than a century of effort, they found that a real city, in roughly the right place, of roughly the right general character, having experienced real destructive events during roughly the right period, did in fact exist, waiting quietly beneath a low hill above a quiet river plain. The story and the place were not, it turns out, entirely separate from one another after all, even if the precise relationship between them remains, and will likely always remain, somewhat impossible to pin down with complete certainty. Perhaps that is a fitting note to end on tonight. Not a tidy, complete answer, but a patient, honest, and ultimately quite satisfying partial one. The kind of answer that careful, honest inquiry into the deep past usually produces, if we are willing to be patient enough and humble enough to accept it on its own terms rather than demanding more certainty than the evidence can actually provide. The hill of Hisarlik continues to stand today, quiet and largely unchanged in its outward appearance from how it has looked for a very long time, holding within itself the accumulated remains of nearly 4,000 years of human settlement, still only partially understood, still available for future generations of patient researchers to study further, using tools and methods that will, in time, likely reveal still more than we currently know. There is no rush to finish this story tonight, nor was there ever any rush, really, across the entire long history we have followed together this evening. The hill has waited a very long time already. It can continue waiting patiently for whatever comes next. If you have stayed with this story all the way to its end tonight, thank you for spending these quiet hours here. And if you drifted off somewhere along the way, as is entirely the intention of this kind of gentle, unhurried documentary, then rest well and know that the story will still be here, patient and unchanged, whenever you next return to it. If you found this kind of calm, factual company helpful for easing into sleep, please consider subscribing so that future quiet histories like this one, covering other forgotten civilizations, remarkable journeys, and ordinary lives from the deep past, can find their way to you whenever you need them again. There is nothing more you need to do right now except rest. Let your breathing continue its own slow, natural rhythm. Let your body remain heavy and comfortable wherever you happen to be resting tonight. And let this quiet hillside, with its many patient layers of buried history, settle gently into stillness in your mind, much as it has settled gently and patiently into the quiet landscape of northwestern Turkey, waiting, as it always has, for whatever comes next. Good night.